Tonight's story begins with a king who loses a duel to a doorway, another who quite literally goes out with a bang at his own funeral, and yet another who somehow manages to stage a coup using nothing but 14 cream buns. You'd expect crowns, glory, and grandeur, but what you'll actually find are chamber pots, ruptured guts, and clouds of incense desperately trying to mask the stench of decay. Welcome to the world of medieval royalty, where the daggers were sharp, but the irony of their deaths was sharper. Before we dive in, take a moment to gently tap that shiny new hype button YouTube just rolled out. It really helps small creators like me fight our way through the algorithm. I'd be hugely grateful. And if you genuinely enjoy this quiet corner of strange storytelling, go ahead and like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's oddly comforting to imagine all of us scattered across the world, drifting off together. Now, get comfortable. Let the noise of the day melt away as we slip back into the shadows of history. You wake with a sour stomach and a tongue coated in the metallic tang of last night's wine. The summer heat has already begun to seep through the palace walls, wrapping itself around you like damp velvet. Your mouth feels as if it's been stuffed with sheep's wool and regret. Servants hover nearby, silent as ghosts, their eyes fixed on some point just past you. They do not meet your gaze. You are, after all, the king, King Westlaws III, by divine right, no less. Even with the lingering taste of sour cherries and bad decisions, you dismiss them with a sluggish wave of your hand, something halfway between grace and irritation. But the pain in your gut coils tighter, twisting like a serpent left to starve. Your coronation was supposed to be glorious. Instead, you've inherited the crowns of Bohemia, Hungary, and Poland, along with 3 unstable thrones and a list of enemies long enough to choke a horse. You are 17, too old to be a boy, too young to die well. The chamber is dim. Sunlight slices through narrow windows, casting sharp lines across the cold stone floor and glinting off the dull, waiting surface of the chamber pot in the corner. You approach it slowly, like a man walking to the gallows. Your stomach convulses, and you mutter a curse under your breath. In Latin, you'd eaten goose the night before, or something that claimed to be goose, but tasted more like disappointment and bile. The wine was heavy, blood red, and laced with a sweetness you now suspect masked something less noble. You settle onto the wooden seat with the resigned hiss of a monarch betrayed by his own intestines. You are not supposed to be alone. Protocol dictates that at least 2 guards stand just beyond the door, that an attendant waits discreetly to whisk away the evidence of your human frailty. But you are tired of protocol. You are tired of the eyes, of the whispers, of being told what sort of king you must be when you are not even sure you are a man yet. You dismissed them all. You wanted 5 minutes of solitude. You may have even said it aloud. Let me sit like a man, not a monarch. The door does not creak. It does not groan or sigh or protest. It opens like a breath held too long. You do not hear it because the blood is rushing to your head. You are thinking of Hungary lost again, and the priest who warned you that sin furs in still water. You are thinking of your father murdered, your grandfather murdered, Your great-grandfather murdered. You are thinking that it is an unkind family tree, and it does not bode well for your own roots. The dagger is narrow and clean and fast. It parts the air behind you like a whisper. There is no shout, no scuffle, just a bloom of pain, so bright it blinds the world for a moment. Your knees jolt, your breath catches, you twist, but your limbs are slow, sluggish, weighted by heat and rot, and the inescapable pressure in your gut. You see nothing, just a blur of motion, a sleeve, perhaps a boot, perhaps a shadow, shaped like a man who once swore allegiance to you. The blade finds your side again, higher this time. The room tilts. The pot tips. You crumple sideways, your robe tangling in, your legs, your bare skin pressed against cold stone that smells faintly of lye and urine. You feel your blood pooling beneath you, soaking into the crack between tiles, indifferent to your title or your crown. It is, as ever, a great equalizer. The assassin is gone before the first servant returns. The girl shrieks, but only once. The guards rush in moments later, swords drawn too late. They find you slumped, tangled, your face frozen in an expression that will become legend. Eyes open, mouth parted, as if you were still trying to issue one final decree. You die there on the floor, beside your own waist. No noble battle, no battlefield elegy, no priest to absolve your final sin. Just silence and the awkward shuffle of feet as the servants debate whether to lift you or wait for someone more appropriate to arrive. Eventually, they cover you with a tapestry stolen from the chapel. It smells of incense and moths. They say you were killed by Hungarian nobles, or maybe Bohemian ones. Some blame the Poles. Some blame your own cousins. Some say you choked on your own bile. That no blade touched you at all. History shrugs, embarrassed. The chroniclers work quickly in Latin in ink, still drying as they whisper to one another about how best to phrase the details. Assassinated in Olomouc sounds better than bled out on the lavatory floor. The scribes omit the chamber pot. They omit the smell. But the people remember. They always do. The rumor spreads like rot beneath a floorboard. A king stabbed on the toilet. The last of the Primuslid dynasty, crowned in 3 lands, slain in his own stink. The poets avoid the subject entirely. The jesters, however, do not. They keep the memory alive in crude limericks and shadow plays acted out behind taverns. Your crown is taken, your titles divided. Your enemies inherit what you could not protect. But it is your death, lowly, unguarded, ignoble, that survives. It slips through the cracks of history's marble pedestal like a bad smell that will not leave the room. And though no monument marks the place where you fell, every man who sits on a throne after you will remember briefly and bitterly that the body is not sacred and that even kings must kneel. The morning begins with incense and phlegm. You wake in the papal bedchamber to a throat that feels as though it has been stuffed with sackcloth and gravel. Every swallow grates. Every breath whistles. It is not the first time this has happened. The Roman air is thick with dust and recrimination. And you are not a young man, but you are the Pope, the first and only Englishman to hold the chair of St. Peter. and there is no dignity in coughing like a common pilgrim. You push the pain down with a draught of honeyed wine and summon your attendants with a hoarse croak that sounds more beast than bishop. They arrive with linens and oils and concerned eyes they think you do not see. One of them dares suggest you postpone the Mass. His voice is soft, his hands folded. You do not respond. Instead, you motion for your vestments, each layer heavier than the last, each fold stiff with embroidered authority. The chassel slides over your shoulders like a shroud woven from expectation. You pull the ring of St. Peter onto your swollen finger and squeeze until it pinches the flesh. You want to feel the weight of office pressing into bone. In the chapel, the air is still and holy. 100 candles flicker like nerves. The marble floor echoes your footsteps, each one sharp and deliberate. The cardinals rise as you enter, a wave of red silk and reverence. You know they speak of you in Latin riddles behind your back. They call you Nicholas Brickspear when they think it's safe, as if the old name could lessen the man. Let them whisper. You are not here for them. You are here for God. You begin the Mass with a voice that trembles at first, then steadies. The Latin rolls off your tongue like hot wax, sanctified and searing. The congregation bows as one, more out of fear than faith. You know this. You welcome it. The swelling in your throat pulses with each syllable, a slow-growing pressure, like a stone being carved from the inside. Still you speak. You raise the chalice. You invoke the mystery of transubstantiation with trembling hands. The bread is brought forward on a golden patent, round and white and silent. You break it. You lift it. You place it on your tongue, the body of Christ offered to the man who claims to speak for him. It sticks. At first, you think it a trick of the dryness. Your throat spasms, and you press a hand to your chest, summoning a cough that does not come. The bread does not move. It clings to the roof of your mouth like ash. You try to swallow, but the muscles seize. Panic flickers behind your eyes. But you raise your hand in what appears to be a benediction. The congregation bows again. They do not see the tremor in your jaw. Your lungs begin to protest. You blink rapidly, trying to maintain the rhythm of the liturgy, but the words come slower now, stretched and strangled. One of the cardinals leans forward, his mouth open as if to speak, but he hesitates. You are the vicar of Christ. You are not meant to falter. The choir continues, voices rising in harmony as your vision narrows. The bread has become a lodestone. It drags at your breath. You grip the altar with both hands, knuckles whitening, sweat slicking the marble. Beneath your fingers, the chalice tips. A thin stream of consecrated wine dribbles onto the cloth, pooling like a wound. Acolytes begin to shift uneasily, glancing toward the cardinal who had questioned your strength this morning. He does not meet their eyes. You try to speak again, but your throat is closed now. The passage sealed by a peace of God, too holy to dislodge. You think briefly of the doctrine you've defended with fire and steel, that this bread is no mere symbol, that it is flesh, living, divine. You wonder, as your knees begin to buckle, whether you're being consumed in return. You fall forward. The crash echoes through the chapel like thunder. The congregation gasps as one. a ripple of scandal and awe. The choir falters, then stops. The cardinals rush to your side, their faces masks of concern, barely concealing the calculations behind. Their eyes, one of them, rolls you onto your back, and your mitre clatters away, spinning to a stop against the foot of the altar. The bread is still in your mouth. Your lips are blue, your eyes are glassy and fixed. Someone tries to pry your jaws apart. Another hisses that to touch the host in such a state is blasphemy. A third murmurs a prayer, though whether it's for your soul or his own advancement is unclear. The altar boy begins to cry. The incense keeps burning. In the days that follow, Rome will murmur. Some will say it was poison. Others will whisper of divine punishment. A few will claim the devil himself forced the bread down your throat. A final humiliation for a pope too proud to kneel. The cardinals will meet in secret, tallying alliances, rehearsing their mournful expressions. The next morning, your body will be found slumped against the altar, carefully repositioned, your face wiped clean, your hands folded neatly in imitation of peace. But they will not forget you, the only English pope, the man who once held 3 kings in check with a letter, the shepherd of Christendom, who choked on Christ himself. The irony is too rich, too perfect. It will live longer than your decrees, your edicts, your name etched in Latin on brittle parchment. It will live in whispered jokes among the clergy, in tavern ballads sung off key, in the knowing glance between monks, when the host sticks to the roof of one's mouth. You are no longer pope. You are anecdote, and the altar remembers the sound you made as you hit the floor. You'd wanted something exotic, something impressive, something none of the French kings could boast about, and certainly nothing your brother Robert could dream of affording. You already had the crown, the castles, the bastard children glinting like scattered coins across the aisles. But what you craved now was spectacle. So, when the emissaries arrived, bearing gifts from the continent, a caged creature the size of a carriage, all muscle and fur and foreign majesty, you accepted it without hesitation. They called it a leopard, or a lion bear, or something equally useless, and you nodded as if you knew what they meant. The important thing was this: it growled low and deep, and it bowed to no one. You housed it in a golden cage inside your private garden just beyond the hunting lodge. The nobles cooped and clapped. The bishops wrung their hands. The peasants crossed themselves and whispered about demons. You named it folk, a ridiculous name for a ridiculous animal, but it made you laugh when you said it aloud. You fed it boar, meat, and honey. You paraded it before foreign guests. You once made your jester ride it briefly before the jester wisely decided to leap into the moat. For months it was your favorite distraction. Your son asked if he could pet it. You said only once. It was supposed to be a celebration that morning, a feast day for some saint you couldn't remember, but one whose martyrdom conveniently aligned with your desire to roast 6 stags and show off your collection of illuminated manuscripts and fine wines. The nobles were already drinking when you decided to bring folk out for a little theatrical amusement. You fancied yourself a man of many gifts: tactician, orator, lover, monarch. But more than anything, you considered yourself brave, the kind of king who could stare down a beast and emerge untouched. You imagined the stories that would ripple through the courts. King Henry, the lion whisperer. Henry, who fed his pet by hand while others trembled behind shields. You ordered the cage opened. The handler hesitated. A man with trembling hands and a scar that looked suspiciously recent. You barked something cruel about cowardice and lineage, and he stepped back without a word. The door creaked open. Folk padded out onto the grass, his massive shoulders rolling beneath his spotted hide like waves beneath silk. His eyes found yours, golden and indifferent. You held out a strip of raw venison with one gloved hand. He took it, jaws clicking shut with a sound that felt too final. There was a pause, a moment of quiet wherein the breeze shifted slightly and the birds went still. And then, with no warning at all, Folk lunged. He did not go for the meat. He went for your throat. You stumbled backwards, instinct abandoning dignity. You raised your arms, but the creature was faster, teeth catching the edge of your sleeve, claws raking across your chest with a precision that felt almost intentional. Somewhere, someone screamed. Someone else laughed, not yet realizing it wasn't a performance. Blood soaked into your silks, warm and bright. You tried to shout commands, but what emerged was a strangled gurgle as Folk's weight drove you to the ground. The nobles fled. The bishops dropped their goblets. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to shoot or bow. It took 3 arrows to make Folk stagger, a 4th to make him retreat. He slunk back toward the cage, dragging one paw slightly, panting like a dog that had run too hard. You lay in the grass, surrounded by trampled roses and your own shredded pride. They carried you inside, half conscious and gasping. A physician with shaking hands tried to stitch your shoulder while muttering a prayer under his breath. Another attempted to cleanse the wounds with vinegar, which made you scream so loudly they heard it in the kitchens. You tried to sit up. They pushed you back down. You tried to speak. Blood filled your mouth. You slapped the nearest servant and passed out before you could issue the apology. For days, the wound festered. You were told not to worry, that kings do not die from scratches, but you could feel it deep in the marrow. The fever took you slowly, gently at first, like a lover slipping into bed beside you. Your breath grew short. Your words became slurred. You woke often in the night, thinking the beast had returned, seeing its yellow eyes in every shadowed corner. They lied in the reports. Of course they did. Said you died of a chill, of dysentery, of something discreet and appropriate. Said you passed peacefully, surrounded by suns in scripture. They burned Folk in a pit behind the stables and forbade his name to be spoken again. But the servants remembered. They always do. Years later, they would whisper it. The king who tamed a beast, then died screaming beneath its paw. The king who wanted to be Caesar, but forgot that the lions were never tame. They tell it to children now, usually with embellishments. The beast grows larger, the king smaller. The ending never changes. It never needs to. You gave the people a spectacle. You got your story. It just wasn't the one you meant to tell. The sun burned high above Paris, unrelenting and theatrical, as if summoned specifically to illuminate your pride. Trumpets blared, hooves thundered, silk flags snapped in the wind. The tournament was everything it was meant to be: opulent, thunderous, a splendid distraction from treaties and succession, and the slow rot beneath your court's golden polish. And you, King Henry II of France, sat at top a raised platform draped in gold brocade, a laurel circling your thinning hair, pretending you weren't sweating through your doublet. You laughed too loudly. You raised your goblet too often. You did not notice how tightly your fists clenched the armrests whenever the lances shattered. They had told you not to come. Catherine, with her cool voice and colder eyes, had warned you. Her astrologers had whispered of iron and splinters, of veiled omens and planetary alignments too unkind to ignore. Diane, your beloved mistress, had cooped that it was beneath you, that kings should not court danger merely to flex before squires and poets. Even your physicians had tried, mumbling about your recent cough, about the dull ache behind your eyes that had persisted for days, but you were king. Warnings are for men who kneel, and this was to be your final celebration before the peace sealed itself in ink. Your daughter's marriage to Philip of Spain was the last brick in a fortress of diplomacy you'd spent years building. The war was ending. You had earned your triumph. Why should you not watch your captains and nobles splinter lances in your name beneath your balcony, beneath your gaze? The crowd roared as another match concluded. One knight tumbling dramatically into the dust, while the other raised his weapon to the sky. You clapped, smiling broadly, your teeth tight. Across the field, banners waved in your colors. The air smelled of crushed grass and sweat and horsed and roasted meat. You breathed it in like victory when Gabriel de Montgomery, your captain of the Scots Guard, took the field for the next match. You leaned forward, your eyes sharpening. He was one of your finest, strong, and young and loyal, the perfect opponent for a showpiece duel. You liked Gabriel. You'd knitted him yourself. You'd hunted with him. You'd watched him bleed for your name, and now he was to close the games in glory, facing off against a fellow noble in a friendly ceremonial clash. But the challenger was late. There was confusion, a pause, pages running. Then someone whispered to you, your name spoken urgently, and pointed toward Gabriel, already armored and mounted, ready. Would you not face him? Would you not at least offer the final salute? You laughed. You declined to ride, of course. Even you were not foolish enough to mount a horse with a full stomach and a pounding head, but you insisted on watching, insisted on the match proceeding under your gaze. With you present, your blessing carved into the moment like a royal seal. They adjusted the lances, they fixed the helms, and as they took their places, you raised your hand, gave the signal. The horses charged. It should have ended like the others. A clean strike, a shattered shaft, a puff of sawdust, and cheers. Instead, there was a sound, less a snap than a scream held in wood, and then silence. A piece of Gabriel's lance, longer than any shard should have been, broke free, spinning unnaturally, as if it had a will of its own. It struck your face just beneath the crown, slipped through the eye like a knife into butter, and stopped only when it met the back of your skull. You did not scream. You did not fall. You sat back in your throne, a splintered javelin jutting from your face, your mouth open in surprise. The court erupted. Catherine stood too slowly. Diane fainted too quickly. Guards surged forward, shoving aside the lesser nobles who were already weeping or vomiting. Gabriel dismounted in horror, pulling at his helmet with shaking hands, mouthing your name over and over again, as if it might pull the lance back out. They did not remove it. Not at first. No one dared touch it. You were carried to the palace, like a fallen saint, upright, gurgling, your eye a ruin, your breath wet with blood. The lance quivered with each bump of the litter. It took you 2 days to die. 2 long, sting days beneath swaths of velvet and candlelight, as physicians debated whether to cut deeper or simply pray harder. You could not speak. Not properly. You could only thrash and moan and blink your one good eye. They dressed you in white, as if purity could be retroactive. They brought in relics, holy water, perfumes to mask the rot. You could smell it anyway. Gabriel tried to kill himself twice. The first time he was stopped by your son Francis, who gripped the young man's arm and said he would not have blamed you. Gabriel did not believe him. He fled France. He never jousted it again. The astrologers pined. Catherine stared at your body without weeping, her silence louder than any widow's wail. Diane was barred from the funeral. They placed you in a golden coffin, your face reconstructed with wax and silk, your eye hidden beneath a patch they swore looked regal. You were buried with your armor. They called it a tragic accident, a noble death. A king failed not by war or treason, but by the very pageantry he so adored. But the people remembered the truth, that you died on a field you were told not to attend, that you ignored the stars and the warnings and the ache in your skull, that you stared down a spectacle and found yourself inside it, that a splinter of wood, not a dagger, not a cannon, not even a word, was all it took to unmake a king. You were late, not very late, but just enough to make the courters shift in their silks and whisper beneath their perfumed breaths. It was a feast night, a diplomatic affair involving a sister, a treaty, and far too many candles for the size of the hall. The Italians were there pretending not to gawk at your height, and your new allies from Brittany were already 3 goblets deep. Your wife had warned you not to make a scene, so naturally, you decided to slip out for a quick tour of the chateau, dragging a handful of nobles with you, like a boy leading friends, into his favorite hiding place. The Chateau d'Amboise had just been renovated. You were proud of it. Vaulted ceilings, gleaming floors, tapestries thick as winter cloaks, and doorways. Well, that was the part still in progress. Some archways were cut for elegance, others for function, and a few hadn't been measured against the fact that you, Charles VII of France, were taller than a man had any right to be. Still, you ducked without thinking. You'd done it 100 times before. A little stoop, a quick lean, and you were through. This time, it didn't go as planned. You'd been joking. Something about the Italians and their tiny horses. Your friends laughed. One of them clapped you on the back. You turned, mid-step, grinning, and walked directly into the stone lintel with a sound like a melon striking marble. The laughter stopped immediately. Cut clean. You staggered. The torchlight blurred. You swore or tried to. What came out was more of a grunt. At first, no one panicked. It was a bump, a bruise. The kind of thing a man laughs about later over wine, especially a king. Someone handed you a cloth. You pressed it to your temple and looked down when it came away red. Not a polite trickle. A rich royal stain. The sort that never really washes out. You told them you were fine. You were not fine. You continued the tour anyway, out of sheer stubbornness. A king does not collapse over masonry. You cracked another joke. Something about having a harder head than the chateau, and everyone laughed this time, more from relief than amusement. You smiled tightly and kept walking, but your steps dragged. You leaned more heavily on the arm of the nearest courtier. You squinted at the candle flames as if they were burning too bright. By the time you returned to the hall, the music had started. You slid into your seat at the head of the table with more effort than you wanted to admit. The room spun slightly, like a carousel, just out of sight. The musician's notes hit strange angles in your ears. You picked at the roast, but did not eat. When your queen asked if you were well, you told her it was the wine. She looked at the cloth still clutched in your fist. It was soaked through. The bleeding didn't stop. You were carried to your chambers an hour later, pale and listing like a ship taking on water. The physician arrived quickly, all peacockses and panic. He pressed his fingers into your scalp and muttered prayers. Another brought leeches. You batted them away. You asked for your confessor. Then, only half aloud, you asked again for the man who had told you the joke about the Italians. You said you wanted to laugh once more. You never did. The pain bloomed behind your eyes like fire beneath glass. Every breath became a labor. Every heartbeat a drumbeat at of regret. No war wound had ever done this to you. No rebellion. No dagger. No arrow. Just a doorway. Just a wall. Just your own body failing to remember its size. You died in your bed, not screaming, not weeping, just fading. A candle that didn't even flicker before it went out. They wrapped your head in linen and spoke of sudden illness. Apoplexy, they said. Some quiet failure of the humors, something noble, something vague. No one wanted to write doorframe in the royal chronicles. The nobles whispered. The peasants, too. Word spread fast that the king had died from a bump, that his skull had cracked like an egg beneath a low arch. The story became a joke before your body had even cooled. Not out of cruelty, out of disbelief. Kings fall in battle. Kings are poisoned. Kings do not die from bad carpentry. But you did. The architects of Ambis took new measurements. Every doorway was recut, every arch adjusted, not out of guilt, but to silence the memory, to erase the ghost of your height from the stone. But it lingered. It always lingered. And now, when someone strikes their head on a lintel in France, there is always a pause, a nervous laugh, and someone says, "Careful, that's how a king died." They don't always remember your name, but they remember the door. They had to shove you in. Even in death, you refused to cooperate. Your body, swollen and sour, with a rod of 2 months' delay, would not bend to the coffin. They'd carved. It was too small. A bishop said it would be blasphemy to cut the corpse. A knight suggested sawing the legs off. Another, one of your more practical servants, offered to just press hard and hope. Eventually, they chose the last. They wrapped you in linens and prayers, and pushed, and the wooden box groaned beneath the strain. So did your body. It had been a long journey from ruin to Khan. Too long. You had died clumsily, undramatically, sprawled in bed after your horse stumbled, and your insides tore themselves open. Not in battle, not at sea. You had died like a sack of bread, left too close to the fire, bloated, leaking, too soft to lift. The surgeons had cut at your stomach to relieve the pressure. It only made things worse. No one wanted to embalm you. The priests whispered excuses. The nobles offered gold. The odor made decisions for everyone. Still, you were the conqueror. You had crushed England beneath your boots. You had rewritten laws, burned cities, and made barons kiss the hem of your cloak. You deserved a cathedral, a procession, a holy resting place, flanked by gold and incense. You would have it, even if your body protested every step. The cathedral was not ready. Some said it had never truly belonged to you, that the land had been seized unjustly from a monastery, the stone quarried with cursed hands. The monks muttered, but the masons built. On the day of your burial, a fire broke out in Cain. Smoke twisted toward the steeples as priests tried to chant over the crackling of nearby rooftops. Half the Moors left before the funeral even began. The other half stayed, sweating in wool and velvet, swatting at flies that would not leave your coffin alone. The bishop tried to move things along. He spoke of your victories, your piety, your great belly full of royal blood. He glossed over the bits where you'd raised villages and blinded hostages. He painted you as a shepherd king, which would have made you laugh had you still possessed lungs to laugh with. The choir sang. The incense flared. Your sons knelt. One of them wept, possibly out of guilt, though it was hard to tell which one felt it. You had raised them like you ruled everything else, with iron and suspicion. Then came the moment they lowered your coffin into the stone tomb, or they tried to. It didn't fit. It should have been simple geometry. The grave had been carved for your height, your width, your rank. But time had intervened. Your flesh had ballooned, stretched, soured. The linen bindings strained at the seams. Your neck bulged against the edge of the coffin, like dough pushing through a split seam. Still, they forced it. They could not cut the box. They could not cut you. So they pushed, and then you burst. A sickening crack, a wet snap, a noise that silenced the choir and turned stomachs. The gas had built for days, fed by heat and time and your own royal decay. The pressure found its moment. Your abdomen tore open. Fluids spilled. Organs slid. The smell hit like a siege weapon. Sudden, absolute, obliterating any pretense of ceremony. Nobles fled. Priests gagged. The bishop dropped the thurible and stepped back, eyes wide, face pale. The crowds surged for the doors, some retching into their sleeves, others crying out prayers that barely made it past the wave of nausea. The choir stopped singing. One boy fainted. Your son stood motionless. They could not run. Not yet. To run would be to abandon you, to admit weakness, to give the world one more story to sneer at. They stood there in the stink, in the hot, rotting air of your final defiance, as your body slumped into its stone bed, like meat falling off a spit. The bishop said nothing more. There would be no final benediction, no chanted absolution. They sealed the tomb quickly, scraping mortar into place with hands that trembled. The ceremony ended with silence and ash. There would be no feast afterward, no commemorative psalms, only gossip. For months, your nobles told different versions. In one, the explosion never happened. In another, it cracked the altar and knocked a candle into the bishop's beard. In taverns, they sang songs about the king who couldn't fit in his own grave, whose belly burst like a boar left too long in the sun. Children giggled about it. Monks wrote about it with careful euphemism. You were a legend in life. You became a punchline in death, and yet they still call you William the Conqueror, because even when your body failed you, even when it burst like an overripe fruit in front of a cathedral full of lords and friars, you remained too large for the box they built. You conquered the land, the people, the laws, and finally, even the dignity of your own funeral. The cathedral still stands. So does the smell, they say, in the stone. You were always going to die at the table. From the beginning, it had been your favorite place to rule. Not the throne, not the war room, not the court of noble flatterers, with their powdered wigs and venomous compliments, but here, beneath the chandeliers, at the long oak table, groaning under silver platters and sweating bottles, here you were, king in every sense, fork in one hand, goblet in the other, dictating courses like decrees. No one told King Adolf Frederick of Sweden to pace himself, not his advisors, not his cooks, and certainly not his stomach, which had long ago stopped issuing warnings. It was Shrove Tuesday, which in Sweden meant indulgence, rich foods before the lean days of Lent. You didn't believe much in fasting, but you adored the feast. So you summoned your chefs, your tasters, your venters, and gave them the royal command. Spare no expense, no restraint. You would dine as if the world were ending, and only your appetite could hold back the void. They delivered. You began with lobster, butter drenched and steaming, the flesh pulling from the shell like silk. Then caviar spooned onto points with such obscene generosity that even the Russians might have winced. Champagne followed, delicate and fizzy, chased by German beer and sweetened wines from the Rhine. The table glistened with roasted game, glazed hams, marzipan fruits, and platters of smoked fish that left your lips shining. You wiped them with a gold-trimmed cloth and asked what was next. Semla, of course. The little bun had become something of an obsession. It was traditional, a soft cardamom wheat, roll hollowed and filled with almond paste, then topped with whipped cream and a snowy crown of powdered sugar. It was eaten in moderation by peasants and priests alike. One, perhaps two, with warm milk on the side, a polite indulgence. You had 14, each one soft, rich, deceptively light, until the cream curled in your throat and the almond paste turned to paste in your chest. But you did not stop. You laughed as you ate. You pointed at your trembling valet and dared him to match you bun for bun. He tried. He failed. You ordered a fresh pot of milk, then another. It tasted sweet and made the sugar easier to swallow. Your stomach began to swell. It was not sudden, not at first, just a vague discomfort, the familiar protest of a body accustomed to being overruled. But this time, the fullness did not pass. It deepened, hardened, turned sharp. You shifted in your chair, burped once, and waved off the concerned look from your chamberlain. A cramp twisted your side, then another. Still, you raised your goblet. By the time you stood, the room had started to tilt. They found you staggering in the hall outside the dining chamber, one hand pressed to your abdomen, the other braced against the wall. Your face was pale, but sweat poured down your temples. You gasped, something no one understood. Perhaps a request for more milk, or for a priest, and collapsed. Your physicians were summoned, but they were not miracle workers. They had seen you like this before, after long banquets or diplomatic dinners, where you'd eaten in an effort to make alliances seem palatable. Usually, it passed. This time, it did not. The spasms came in waves. Your stomach had become a battlefield, your insides rebelling against their king. They tried all the usual remedies, puces, leeches, hot towels soaked in vinegar. Nothing worked. The pain deepened, then became something more than pain, a kind of pressure, as if your own organs were attempting escape. The bloating was visible, now grotesque in its fullness. The stomach stretched tight as a drum beneath your nightshirt. You moaned, you begged, you cursed the sembla, then asked for one more just in case. You died sometime after midnight, belly distended, mouth still flecked with cream. The palace tried to cover it, of course. Officially, it was digestion problems. Some said apoplexy, others suggested stroke, but the servants knew. The kitchen knew. The man who had carried the platter of semla buns into the dining room wept when he heard. He said he should have brought only 6. You were buried with ceremony, draped in velvet, your coffin carved with laurels and lions. They said prayers. They sang hymns. But all the talk afterward was of the meal. Not the funeral banquet, but the last one. The feast that outlasted the king. For decades, children in Sweden whispered the story with reverence and revulsion. How a monarch died not in battle or bed, but from dessert. You weren't the first gluttonous king, not by far, but few had your flair. Few made it look so deliberate. You ate like it was a duty, a performance, a crown on a plate, and in the end, it consumed you. They still eat semla on Shrove Tuesday. 1 bun, maybe 2, if they're feeling bold. They soak them in warm milk and smile nervously. No one has 14, not anymore. The night was too dark for certainty. That was the first mistake. The sky had been clear when you left the castle. A thin frost on the ground, a breeze slicing through the pines, but no clouds. The stars glinted like hammered nails, and the moon threw enough light for pride to thrive. You could have waited. No one would have blamed you. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't war. It wasn't politics. Just a runaway peasant and a burst of irritation. But you were the king. And when a king wants a man found, he does not wait for dawn. You rode alone mostly. The guards tried to keep up, but you waved them off. Their torches were slow, and your horse was fast. A tall black beast with a wild name and iron shoes. The sound of its hooves on frozen ground was a thrill you never got tired of. You were 44 and ruled from sea to sea, but the saddle still made you feel like something older, like a wolf with a crown. The peasant no one remembers his name now, had broken something, a rule, a vow, perhaps just a fence. He had run from your tax collectors, refused a tithe, maybe struck a man in the village square. It didn't matter. He had defied you, and that was enough. So you'd kicked your heels into the horse's sides and chased after him through the night, your breath clouding behind you like a banner of smoke. The cliffs came fast. They always do when you're not looking for them. One moment it was forest and scrub, and the next the land gave way. The sea thundered below, black and shapeless, like something waiting to laugh. You didn't see the edge until your horse did. It reared, panicked, snapped its head to the side, and you, proud, freezing, furious, and lost your seat. The world tilted. You flailed for reins that weren't there. For once, your crown did not help. You fell, not far, not to the sea, just enough to break you. The ground below the cliff's edge wasn't sheer stone, but it wasn't soft either. You landed badly, shoulder first, then your head. Something snapped. The stars blinked. Your body rolled once and stopped like dropped game. The horse kept running. The peasants in the hills said they heard your scream echo through the valley, sharp and sudden and undignified. It didn't sound like a king. You were alive for a little while. Cold seeped in faster than blood. You couldn't move your legs. Your mouth worked, but there was no one to hear the words. The guards were still. Behind you, torches bobbing like dying fireflies in the woods. You watched them from below the ledge, waiting for their light to find you. It never did. Your hands twitched in the frost. You tried to shout again, but your voice was gone. The wind picked up, salt and pine and something bitter. Your horse came back once, snorting, pacing, then vanished again into the trees. They didn't find you until morning. The sky was gray by then, and your body had stiffened in the grass like old leather. Your cloak had snagged on a root, stretched like a flag beside your broken frame. One boot had come loose. Your crown was back at the castle, on its pillow. You looked nothing like a monarch. Just another man who rode too fast into the dark and thought the night would move out of his way. The peasant got away. They said later that he returned to his village with wild eyes and trembling hands, claimed he heard hoofbeats in his dreams for months. He never said what he'd done wrong. Maybe he hadn't done anything. Maybe he just ran and you chased him, because kings need to chase something. And there was nothing else that night. Your death broke the line. Without you, the kingdom frayed. Factions rose, families fought, and the crown passed from head to trembling head. England watched. France sniffed opportunity. Lords drew maps with knives. It all unraveled faster than anyone expected, like a cloak pulled loose by a thorn. The nobles whispered your name with something like fondness, because that's what people do with the dead. They said you were bold, that you had spirit, that you didn't know fear. But the peasants remembered the scream, and the horse kept running. The wound wasn't supposed to kill you. That's the thing. You'd had worse. Sword cuts, fevered gashes, broken bones splined in cold towers by trembling hands. But this was just a slash along the leg. Deep, yes, but manageable. It wasn't even from battle, just an accident. One of the many petty hazards of living long enough to become a problem for everyone, including yourself. They'd come to dress it, as they always did. Your physicians and servants and bootlickers who still feared the old rumors, Charles the Bad. They called you not to your face, but close enough for you to smell it on them. The Poisoner King, the treacherous one. Your enemies accused you of murdering your own brother with a poisoned orange. You never denied it. You had survived rebellions, assassins, and your own terrible instincts, clawing your way to the throne of Navarre with more cunning than grace. You were hated, but powerful, and power is a kind of armor until it isn't. They soaked the cloth in brandy. That was the second mistake. The first was letting them in at all. You didn't trust your healers, but you trusted the pain less. The leg had gone hot and swollen. The skin around the wound puffed up like boiled meat. Someone said brandy would sterilize it. They said it gently, as if your body could still be persuaded, so they brought the barrel. A small one, not the grand casks reserved for banquets and treaties, but a squat, heavy drum that sloshed when lifted. They cracked it open beside your bed, the fumes rising like a fog, sweet and sharp. The cloth was dipped and wrung, steaming slightly in the cold air. You didn't flinch. You were used to burning. They wrapped your leg with the soaked rags, layer after layer, until the scent of alcohol overpowered even the stink of infection. The candles flickered. Your chamber was dim, save for the fire and a few flickering tapers at the edge of the room. One was set too close. No one noticed. The servant who lit it was new, nervous. She stepped back too quickly, her hand brushing the edge of your blanket, just enough to sway it, just enough to send the hem drifting toward the floor, where a candle had been set to warm the room. Just enough. The cloth ignited in silence. There was no crack or roar, just a sudden bloom of flame. It caught the brandy first, then the linen, then your leg. You didn't scream at once. For half a second, your brain tried to explain it as a dream or fever or punishment. Then the pain reached you. You screamed. The fire surged. The soaked rags hissed and popped, flames licking upward with horrifying speed. Your servants panicked, grabbing at cloaks, blankets, bare hands, smacking the blaze. But the brandy had soaked into everything. The sheets, the gauze, the floor rushes beneath your bed. One man tried to throw wine on the fire. Confused by instinct, the fire laughed. You thrashed. Your leg was gone to agony, but you still had your arms, your voice, your fury. You struck one man across the face, bellowed for water, for help, for death, anything. The flames spread. The smoke thickened. Someone finally pulled you from the bed, dragging your scorched body across the stone floor. It was too late. Your leg was blackened, bubbling at the edges. The skin peeled in sheets. The wound they'd come to treat had become something else. An inferno. An ending. They tried to save you, of course. Tried salves, fuses, prayers. They called for monks. They called for more wine. You lasted a day, long enough to know what was happening, long enough to curse everyone in the room, to blame the servant, the cloth, the barrel, the wind, long enough to feel the heat, not just in your body, but in the stories that would come after. You knew what they'd say. They wouldn't remember the rebellions you crushed, or the treaties you manipulated. They'd forget your cunning, your brutality, your iron grip on a kingdom that never wanted you. They'd forget the poisonings, the betrayals, the time you survived an uprising by hiding in a wine cask, waiting out the screams. They'd remember the fire, the candle, the leg wrapped in brandy-soaked cloth, lit like a festival torch. They called you Charles, the bad before. Afterward, they called you worse, not to insult your cruelty, but your ridiculousness. You became a lesson, a punchline, a warning about vanity and flammable fabrics. Painful, certainly, but undignified, and that was the part that stuck. No one wanted to mourn a man who died like that, so they didn't. They buried you quickly. No lavish procession, no golden tomb, just dirt and a headstone and a few charred rags burned beyond recognition. A king reduced to cinders because someone thought a splash of brandy was medicinal. They never did find the servant who lit the candle. Maybe she fled in terror. Maybe someone helped her disappear. Maybe she watched from the woods, waiting for the fire to die. Some said she'd been sent, that it hadn't been an accident at all, that your enemies had waited years for a chance and took it with one careless flame. Or maybe it really was just a mistake, the kind that clings to your name forever. The storm rolled in like a war you refused to believe in. It had no armies, no banners, no messengers announcing terms, just wind and clouds, thick as bruises, marching across the sky with a silence that felt personal. You saw it from your tower, watching the sea churn under gray fists, and you smiled the way only kings smile, like nothing in the world could possibly be meant for you. You were old by then, older than you had expected to be. Kings rarely grow soft in Denmark. Most bleed out in battle, or slip on a blade in court, or drink too much out of boredom and die in bed while their heirs circle like wolves. But you, Valdemar, the victorious, they'd called you once. You had outlived your enemies, your brothers, your captors, even your own legend. You ruled in a time that no longer wanted you, propped up by memory and ceremony, and the sheer stubborn weight of your presence, and of course by the crown. It wasn't made for comfort. Iron, not gold, forged thick and heavy, with angles that cut into the scalp if you wore it long enough, which you did. You refused to take it off, not even to sleep. Servants tried. Advisors begged. Your sons muttered about migraines and skin infections. You ignored them all. The crown was yours. You had earned it, not once but twice, taken prisoner in Germany, dragged in chains, humiliated before bishops and emperors, and still you'd clawed your way back to the throne. Lost lands, lost children, lost favor, yes, but not this, never this. It had become a part of you. The storm broke while you were walking the battlements, a king's habit, a ritual, more than a necessity. Though you liked to believe your presence still meant something, wind slapped your cloak against your legs, and your boots echoed over slick stones. The rain began as mist and grew teeth. Your guards urged you inside. You waved them off. You thought the sky was posturing. You forgot it could strike. The lightning came with no warning, no rumble, no flash to boom delay. Just light, raw and immediate, like the gods had drawn a blade and brought it down on your head. It found you not because you were king or sinful or arrogant, but because iron conducts. The crown did what it was designed to do. It held fast. It stayed fixed to your skull, like loyalty, and when the bolt found it, It had nowhere else to go. You seized before you fell. One leg kicked out, the other buckled. Your arms flung wide like a saint's. The crown did not melt, but it glowed for an instant, casting a halo of firelight around your stunned, rigid face. Your beard singed at the tips. Your mouth opened, then you dropped. They say your body hit the stone so hard that the crown rang like a bell. The guards rushed forward, slipping, cursing, shouting your name into the wind. You didn't answer. Smoke curled from your hairline. Your eyes were open, but empty. One hand twitched once, reflex or refusal. No one could say. The storm moved on. They tried to remove the crown. They couldn't. Your head had swollen from the heat. The iron gripping your temples like a fist. It had fused to you in places. Tiny welds where skin metal. They poured water. They wrapped cloth. One man suggested cutting it free, and was struck across the face before he could finish the thought. Another wept. A priest said it was a sign, a punishment, a reward, a mistake. They buried you with it, still on. No gilded tomb, no painted epitaph, just stone, dark and plain, and a legend too heavy to carry. Without wincing, you had held onto the crown because you believed it to find you. In the end, it did. There were debates afterward. Had the iron been cursed? Had your refusal doomed you? Was it pride or principle or just another accident in a world full of sharp edges and bad timing? Your sons ruled in your place. None wore the crown as you had. Some avoided it entirely. Others commissioned lighter versions. Gold velvet linings, hollow bands with jewels sewn into wax, comfortable crowns for fragile men. But in paintings, they still showed yours. Iron, black, brutal. No one remembered the treaties you brokered, the churches you built, the laws you signed. They remembered the sound your body made when it hit the stone, the flash of light on iron, the way the crown held fast. They remembered that you died as you lived, refusing to let go. The court said it was a robbery, a tragic misfortune, a regrettable lapis insecurity. But no one believed that. Not really. Not the guards who found you with your throat opened like a feast. Not the nobles who exchanged glances over the funeral procession, and certainly not the servants who'd watched you year after year treat the palace like your private theater and its people like props. No, they didn't believe it was robbery. Not when the weapon was a cheese knife. You were supposed to be safe. That was the entire premise of kingship. No matter how many battles you lost, no matter how many treaties soured, you were untouchable in your own bed. Guards at the doors, spies in the walls, and a crown above your head that made men hesitate before even imagining harm. You wore it like armor. You acted like it couldn't be removed. But protection doesn't always come from iron. Sometimes it comes from knowing when to stop. You never learned that part. The chambermaid was new, not too new, just long enough to learn where the creaky boards were and how to keep her head down when the quarters passed. She had a name, but you never bothered to learn it. She was just another girl from the village, brought up to polish brass and avoid eye contact. You thought she was quiet because she was simple. You thought silence meant permission. The court whispered about your appetites, not loudly, just enough that people pretended not to hear. Your liaison had been tolerated when you were younger, handsome, charming, in that particular royal way, entitled but amusing. But you had grown lazy with age, less clever, more cruel, and the servants bore the weight of it. No one saw her enter your chambers that night. You had sent for wine, possibly her. The records disagree. There was a feast earlier, one of those winter affairs with too much food and not enough joy. Someone had given a toast that turned into an argument. You left early, grumbling about loyalty, about respect, about how you'd won wars with men more obedient than your current council. You were drunk. You were always drunk. You reclined on the bed, still half-dressed, one boot off, the other dangling. The crown sat on a table beside a half-eaten pear. She brought in the tray. Wine, cheese, a knife. What happened next isn't in the chronicles. There were no witnesses, no trial, just blood, and then a silence that stretched longer than the night. But they say you smiled when you saw her, that you beckoned her closer with the same hand that had signed 100 death warrants, that you said something meant to charm, but it came out slurred and tired. She didn't smile back. The first cut was shallow, just below the ear, sharp enough to draw your attention, but not enough to kill. That was deliberate. She wanted you to feel it, wanted you to register the moment something changed. You grabbed at her wrist, or tried to, but the wine had slowed your hands, and the velvet of your robe tangled around your arm. The second cut opened your throat. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She wiped the knife on the edge of your robe, set it back on the tray, and walked out the same way she came in, past the guards, who nodded at her, thinking nothing of it, past the great doors with iron hinges, past the cold marble that had never learned to care about blood. They didn't find you until dawn, your body slumped sideways, mouth gaping like you had something to say at the end, but forgot what it was. The wine had spilled, soaking into the rushes, mixing with the dark smear that had drained from your neck. The crown was still there, untouched. No robbery. That was the part that puzzled them. The untouched crown. Why leave it unless it was never about gold? The court scrambled. Blame shifted like wet leaves. They arrested 2 kitchen boys, then a steward, then a guard. None of them confessed. No one even seemed afraid. And the girl, she was gone, vanished into the hills, or the city, or the sea. No one ever found her. Some said she had help, that one of the queens, your wife, your mistress, even your sister, had whispered in her ear. Others said she acted alone, and that made it worse because it meant anyone could have done it. Your death didn't start a war, but it ended a conversation about power, about punishment, about how far a king could lean into his vices before the servants leaned back. The nobles mourned you loudly, ostentatiously, but behind the curtains no one cried. The maid became legend. They sang about her in taverns, though they never used her name. The Ballad of the Cheese Knife, they called it. Part comedy, part warning. Peasant girls laughed over it. Soldiers nodded, like they understood something new. It was passed from mouth to mouth, until even your allies began to smile at the wrong part. You had ruled Denmark, but you never ruled her. The brothel sat just beyond the city gates, past the smoke and the weeping, past the signs painted in ash, warning of judgment and death. It wasn't discreet, not anymore. Once it had been tucked behind hedges and church shadows, the kind of place wealthy men visited in masks and left with stains they told no one about. But in plague time, all things came into the light. The hedges were dead now, brittle as bone. The shadows had fled with the priests. What remained was a house of flesh, lit by candlelight and defiance, filled with people who believed that if the end had come, they would meet it drunk, grinning, and buried in silk. You were one of them, a noble once, a duke, or a baron, or a third cousin to someone important. It didn't matter anymore. Titles meant little when the bells wouldn't stop ringing. When the streets were crowded, not with carriages, but carts full of the dead. When your own steward began to cough blood into his hands and asked if he could be buried near the orchard, as if that would make the worms kinder. So you left, not out of cowardice, you told yourself, but because there was nothing more to be done. The court had scattered. The palace was thick with mildew and silence. The priests spoke of sin and repentance, until they too started dying and rose. You had gold. Gold could still move things. Feet, lips, thighs. So you went to where the candles still burned, where the wine still flowed, where people didn't cry unless it was for pleasure or laughter. The brothel had turned into something else entirely, not just a place of transaction, but of refusal, a fortress of denial, where the world's rules had been suspended. The mad came here, and the rich, and the terrified. Some came masked, pretending the velvet over their nose would protect them. Others came naked, convinced that death would at least be distracted by beauty. There were musicians with fevered eyes, courtesans with bruises they swore were bites and not signs. The wine was bad, the food worse, but no one complained. You could still hear laughter. You wanted to forget, so you drank and you watched and you indulged. The woman who took you upstairs that night had eyes like black glass and a mouth that never smiled unless you weren't looking. She said her name was Isabeau, though you were certain it wasn't. She smelled of cinnamon and something darker. She wore rings on every finger and looked at you like you were already part of the furniture. She didn't ask your name. You told her. Anyway, you rambled about your lands, your dog, the priest who once said you'd be a great man. If only you'd stop lying to yourself. She listened with the disinterest of someone who'd heard it all and worse and better. Her fingers undid your shirt. Her lips grazed your neck. Her hands were warm. Then she coughed just once, a delicate sound, like lace tearing. You froze. She didn't. You told yourself it was nothing. The rooms were cold. The air was thick with incense and smoke. Everyone coughed. Everyone sweated. You were here to forget. Remember, you weren't one of the poor fools dragging bodies through the alleys. You weren't a fisherman in rags, praying outside a locked chapel. You were noble. Your blood was old and arrogant. Your bones had never bowed to fear. So, you stayed, even when you saw the dark patch blooming on her collarbone, even when she whispered something in a language you didn't know, or maybe just drunken Latin slurred by fever, even when she kissed you harder, like she knew something was ending and wanted to take you with her. In the morning, you couldn't move your legs. At first you thought it was wine. Then you saw your toes. black at the edges, like they'd been dipped in ink. You tried to stand, but the floor tilted. Someone screamed downstairs. A door slammed. The musician had stopped playing. The silence was worse than the music. Isabo was gone. The bed smelled of sweat and clothes. You rolled over and retched, bile staining the sheets. Your mouth was dry. Your breath stank of rot. A boil had begun to rise beneath your jaw, tight and red and pulsing like a second heart. You touched it and cried out. Your hand came away wet. Outside, the city had begun to burn. They said it was an accident. A lantern dropped. A riot started. But you knew it was panic. Fire was just another form of prayer. Now smoke rose in pillars. People screamed names that no longer mattered. The brothel filled with coughing. Someone sobbed through the wall. Someone else sang a hymn off-key and slow, as if dragging their soul across hot coals. You tried to get up, tried to leave, but your body betrayed you. The legs that once strutted through court couldn't hold your weight. The arms that once raised goblets now trembled with each breath. You died before nightfall, alone, soaked in fever, on a mattress that smelled like cloves and regret. By morning, the brothel was empty. No one buried you. No one wrote your name down. The rats got there first. The crown passed to a cousin. The plague passed to another town. The world spun forward, dragging its dead behind it. They never found Izeb. The pig wasn't supposed to matter. That was the point. That's why you picked it. That's why you had the court to stitch it a crimson robe with man trim. Why you had the pages carry it in on a litter, usually reserved for cardinals. And why you sat grinning in the front row as the entire hall erupted into laughter the moment the crown touched its bristled head. It was a farce, a jest, a living insult to men who wore rings too large and gave sermons too long. You called it a statement. The clergy called it a crime. But at the time, you were too entertained to care. You had grown bored of your own court months ago. The war was over. The taxes were collected. Your enemies were in chains or graves, and the nobles had turned soft in peace, swapping stories instead of swords. You needed something sharp, something disruptive, something fun. So you turned to satire. You gathered poets and playwrights, drunks and madmen, artists you'd once exiled for being too clever with their insults. You brought them back and told them to go further. Nothing sacred, no exceptions, especially not the church. You'd grown tired of men in robes telling you that God did not laugh. So you gave him something to laugh at. The pig came from a village just outside your summer estate, fat, mottled, and stupidal, looking enough to play the part. You named it Archbishop Hamwill, a joke so blunt you thought it was brilliant. The ordination took place on a feast day, just after the real bishop had sent yet another letter begging you to reconsider your increasingly offensive amusements. You didn't write back. You had better things to do, like choreographing the pig's entrance and assigning lines to the actors who would play graveling monks and bootlicking nobles. It was a production, a spectacle, a mock coronation, complete with incense and hymns and staged miracles. The pig walked through it all, led on a silver leash, grunting, drooling, and occasionally defecating on priceless carpets. The audience howled. You laughed until you choked. Even the scribes had trouble keeping their quills steady. The satire was so pointed, so cruel, that some began to wonder whether the pig might actually be smarter than the priests it mocked. And then something changed. They say it happened in the third act, the fake sermon, a line about pigs, flying, and saints weeping. The crowd was roaring. You stood to toast. The pig stared at you. It locked eyes. You didn't notice at first. You were too busy laughing, waving your goblet, tossing gold coins into the crowd. But the pig didn't break eye contact. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It just stood there as if suddenly aware of what had been done to it, as if the crown on its head wasn't a joke, but a burden. Then it charged. There was no warning, no snort, no squeal, no shuffle, just motion. One moment it stood before the altar. The next it was airborne, straight toward you. And for the first time in your reign, your bodyguards froze. It hit you like a sack of bricks, tusks scraping flesh, hooves battering ribs. The crown fell. You fell harder. The pig didn't stop. It bit. It clawed. It thrashed like a demon, summoned by mockery and fueled by humiliation. You screamed. No one moved. The laughter had turned to silence, the kind that bruises a room and leaves it cold. By the time they pulled it off you, you weren't breathing. Your face was shredded, one eye gouged, your throat torn open. The pig had bitten off 2 of your fingers and 1 of your ears. Blood soaked the velvet of your doublet, pooling in the embroidery. You had crowned the animal. It had returned the favor with judgment. The court scattered. Some tried to claim it was witchcraft, that someone, likely a bitter cleric or a spurned mistress, had cursed the beast. Others said it was divine punishment, that the pig had been touched by a higher power to avenge the mockery of holy things. A few, whispering in dark corners, wondered if it had been planned all along, that someone smarter than you had seen the arc of the joke and chosen to end it with blood. The pig disappeared. No one could say how. It wasn't killed, nor imprisoned, nor roasted for the feast. It simply vanished, as if whatever had possessed it had no more use for it once the work was done. Some say it still wanders the forests, crown half sunk into its brow, waiting to be mocked again. Others believe it ascended. Your funeral was brief. The priests who refused to bless your body didn't hide their smiles. The eulogies were thin and frightened. No one wanted to say your name too loudly, not because they feared you, but because they feared the joke might still be listening. The court artists burned their sketches. The playwrights vanished into countryside inns. Satire died quietly that season, but the memory didn't. In taverns and alleys, people began to tell the story of the king who crowned a pig, of the pig who took offense, of how power wears many faces, and some of them grunt. The tale grew with each telling. The pig became larger, faster, more articulate. Some versions gave it wings. Others gave it words. In every version, you died screaming, and the crown landed in the dirt. They never restored that model of court entertainment again. No more gestures with too much license. No more satirical pageants. No more farm animals in regalia. The humor had gone out of the room, along with your blood. The kingdom returned to piety, quiet, safe, and slightly afraid of pigs, especially the clever ones. It wasn't the wine that killed you. Not really. That came later. What killed you was the decision to speak too freely, plot too openly, and trust that your noble blood could bleach any stain clean. You were a duke, Plantagenet, a brother to a king, and still you managed to play the game badly enough to lose everything but the memory of your own absurd exit. They say you were charming once, golden-haired, tall, magnetic in the way that only second sons can be, unburdened by rule, but drunk on possibility. You had a voice that could talk steel into silk, and for a while that was enough. You flattered your way into power, married a fortune, dipped your fingers in politics like they were bowls of cream. The court adored you until it didn't. The people chanted your name until they remembered your debts. You were the kind of man who looked at a throne and saw a chair slightly too empty, who mistook ambition for destiny, and forgot how many cousins you had with daggers under their smiles. You turned on your brother because you thought you could win. That was your first mistake. The second was assuming that mercy had a longer memory than fear. You plotted, whispered, poisoned words as easily as wine. You sided with the wrong people, and then with the right people. But too late. You tried to keep your footing while the ground shifted, dancing between treason and loyalty like they were steps in a minuet. But even the most graceful stumble eventually. So you were arrested, dragged from your rooms, stripped of titles, your estates confiscated, and your allies scattered. The tower swallowed you next, all damp stone and echoing regrets. You pace the cell in circles, tracing lines in the mortar with your fingernail, imagining what the gossip at court must sound like. How many versions of your fall were already circulating? In some you wept, in others you confessed, in a few you fought 10 guards and nearly escaped. You liked that version best. They offered you a trial. You refused it. There were no witnesses left who would speak for you, and none who hadn't already spoken against you. So you pleaded your case, not with words, but with wine. You asked to die in a butt of MSY. They laughed at first. The lords who heard the request leaned back in their chairs, wondering if madness had finally bloomed in your brain like mold on bread. But then they realized it wasn't madness. It was flair. You wanted the final act to be memorable. If you couldn't escape the axe, you could at least write the ending. And they agreed. The executioners didn't wear black hoods. They didn't need to. This wasn't a public beheading. There would be no crowd, no scaffold, no thunderous applause or horrified gasps. Just a quiet room and a large cask brought in with some effort and a few jokes that nobody laughed at too loudly. The wine was dark and sweet, a vintage older than your betrayal. The cask was enormous, enough to hold several men. You examined it like a critic. You sniffed the rim. You even smiled. Then you stepped in. The liquid was cold, colder than you expected. Syrup thick and sluggish as it swallowed your legs. It climbed your chest, your throat, your lips. You took one last breath, scented with grapes and ruin, and then you disappeared. There was no thrashing, no splash, no screams, just a few bubbles, a ripple, and the hollow silence of men watching. A man turn into legend, Afterward, they bottled some of it. No one knows who started the rumor, but it stuck. That somewhere someone kept a flask of that mezzy, convinced it held a bit of your soul, or at least the tang of treason. It became a court joke, then a collector's obsession. Some even claimed to have tasted it, said it was rich and bitter, and went down like a confession. You became a warning, not against ambition, which never truly falls out of fashion, but against dramatics, against thinking that a clever death makes a foolish life any less foolish. You were mourned briefly, remembered, often, immortalized, always, but not for your battles, or your titles, or your fleeting place in the line of succession. You were remembered because you drowned in wine, because when the end came, you chose excess, chose symbolism over subtlety, chose to be theatrical in a world that rewards silence. And the wine didn't mind. It welcomed you. It wrapped around your limbs and seeped into your lungs, baptizing you in everything you'd ever indulged in. You had always been thirsty for power, for praise, for legacy. In the end, you drank too deeply. Or maybe the wine drank you. The feast had been long, loud, and full of meat. You'd barely touched the venison, but the wine you'd taken your share. Prince John of France, son of Philippe, heir to a crown and bearer of centuries of carefully shaped bone and blood. You were 17, not a child, not quite a man, and certainly not a king. Not yet, but close enough to taste it, and eager enough to believe it would be there in the morning. They held the banquet in Lyon to honor your arrival. The room was warm, rank with smoke and perfume, the walls echoing with slurred Latin and overconfident toasts. The nobles laughed too hard. The bishops sweated through their collars. You played your part, nodded, smiled, raised your goblet when you were supposed to, though your hand trembled just slightly. You'd been feeling ill for days, a tightness in your chest that no physician could name. But the feast didn't wait, and you weren't raised to refuse your place at the head of a table. You drank past it, through it, let the heat of the room and the bloodless faces around you blur until it didn't matter. The food turned bland, then sour, then invisible. Someone told a joke about the English. You didn't laugh, but your lips moved like you might have. You were tired, so tired, that even your spine, that delicate piece of royal posture, gave up and curved under your robe. When your head dipped, they thought you were praying. When it ended, you left too quickly. The cold outside wrapped itself around you like a second skin. Crisp white breath met the black night air. A few servants offered to guide you back to your chambers, but you waved them off. You were fine. You were the prince. You didn't need an escort to your own bed. You'd grown up in castles twice the size of this one, ridden through snowstorms without complaint, memorized the layout of unfamiliar cities faster than most men remembered their prayers. Besides, the snow had a strange kind of beauty to it. It fell silently, thick and clean, masking the mud and filth of the streets in a temporary illusion of peace. You pulled your cloak tighter, trying to remember which narrow alley led toward the abbey, but everything looked blurred now. White on white, shadow on shadow. The wine was still talking in your veins, a lullaby of heat and silence. The chest pain returned. sharper this time, as if someone had buried a stone between your ribs. You sat down to catch your breath, a stone step beside a wooden post. Nothing royal about it. The snow reached your knees. The wind nipped at your ears, but the quiet was nice. Nicer than the feast, nicer than the court, nicer maybe than the throne itself. So you stayed there just for a moment, just until the pressure passed, just until your legs stopped shaking. You tilted your head back and watched the sky unload more cold. You thought about your mother's voice, high and French and far away. You thought about the crown that waited for you in Paris, already polished, already whispered over in council rooms. You closed your eyes and you never opened them again. The city found you the next morning, frozen like a statue that no sculptor had planned. Your lips were blue, your hands stiff, your robe crusted in ice. They tried to warm you, to shake you back to life, to call your name as if it were a magic word. But your name didn't matter anymore. You had been prince. Now you were a warning. You died on your way to the throne, not in battle, not by blade or poison or the scheming of rivals, not even from the mystery illness that had stalked your lungs. You died in the snow alone. One alley from your bed, one season from your reign. No great legacy, no royal proclamation. Just a 17-year-old boy who couldn't make it home. The rumors bloomed quickly. Some said you'd been cursed, punished for your father's sins or your grandfather's wars. Others whispered that you had been assassinated quietly, suffocated by political necessity, with the snow used to cover the truth. A few insisted you had simply wandered too far, too drunk, too stubborn, that the arrogance of royalty had assumed the snow would make way for you. It didn't. France moved on. It had to. A throne can't wait forever. Your brother stepped forward, shivering slightly in robes that didn't fit him yet. Quarters changed allegiances with the ease of flipping a coin. Your name was engraved in stone, but already fading in voice. The feast was never mentioned again. But once a year, on the night the snow first falls, the kitchens in Lyon keep a seat empty, not in reverence, not in mourning, in memory of the boy who mistook a kingdom for something guaranteed. It began with a joke about a goose, not a clever joke, not a well-crafted barb, or a courtier's witticism sharpened over wine and politics. Just a joke, stupid and heavy and feathered, plucked from the imagination of a tired king sitting on a chamber pot. You'd been ill for days or weeks, depending on who you asked and how many physicians they had bribed to say it wasn't serious. Your stomach hurt. Your legs wouldn't carry you. The throne of Aragon had become a literal seat, ceramic and humiliating. The court whispered about gout, indigestion, poison. You told them it was simply too many figs. The truth was probably somewhere between all of it. You'd ruled long enough to know that causes were always convenient fiction, and the body rarely offered a straight answer. You were alone in your chambers, wearing silk, sweating through it. Outside, the kingdom bled itself dry, trying to guess who would wear your crown next. You had no heirs, no sons, only nieces and nephews, and men with tenuous claims scratching at the marble walls with parchment and seals. A dynasty ending is a loud thing, but inside your room it was quiet. The jester was late. That annoyed you. You were the king, and even now, especially now, you deserved your jester on time. So when he finally arrived, puffed and breathless, and smelling faintly of travel dust, you snapped at him. He bowed and stammered and said he was delayed by an amusing incident. You narrowed your eyes. He hesitated. Then he told you the joke. It wasn't really a joke. It was a report disguised as one. A young man had been tending to a vineyard and had seen a goose eating from a fig tree. He threw a stone, hoping to scare it off. The goose didn't fly. It fell. When the man approached, he found the goose lying on its back, legs straight, as if crucified. The figs had killed it. It had eaten so many. It suffocated. The man brought the bird home and served it to his family that night, a feast born of gluttony, a meal seasoned with irony. That was the joke. You stared at the jester. He braced for your anger, but instead you laughed. First a chuckle, then a wheeze, then something deeper, messier, bubbling up from your belly like a long-buried secret. You laughed until your vision swam, until your chest spasmed, until tears smeared the sweat on your cheeks. You laughed so hard that the jester backed away, unsure whether he had pleased or doomed himself. You laughed until your breath broke, and then you stopped. They say your last words were a repetition of the punchline, gasped out between fits. The goose died of figs. Your voice cracked like a child's, high and wild, and then silence. No trumpets, no prayers, no family gathered at the bedside, just a toppled monarch in a gilded chamber pot, face frozen mid-chortle, like a madman caught in a private joke. No one else understood. The court tried to make sense of it. They dressed it in dignity. They said you passed peacefully, that your soul departed during reflection, that your final hours were serene. But the servants knew, the ones who found your body, limbs stiff, eyes open, they knew you died laughing, alone at a goose, and somehow that was worse than dying in battle or bed. It was worse than poison or betrayal or even the slow decay of age. It was undignified in a way the chronicles could barely stomach. Monarchs aren't supposed to die of mirth. They are meant to fall with swords in their hands, or with their hands clenched into fists, or whispering state secrets into a trusted ear, not giggling themselves to death because a bird ate too much fruit. But you did, and after you died, everything frayed. The succession was a disaster. Pretenders sprouted like weeds. Alliances snapped. Aragon trembled under the weight of too many claimants, each one more distant and desperate than the last. No one could agree on who should inherit. You had left no heirs, only an anecdote, the Goose King, the fig. They debated your legacy in marble halls and candle-lit chapels. Some tried to say your laughter was divine, a sign of joy in your final moments. Others whispered that madness ran in your blood. A few simply nodded grimly and said nothing because they had also laughed once, and the memory made them uneasy. Still the story spread. Peasants repeated it in taverns. Foreign courts shared it with pitying smiles. Bards softened it, made it poetic, layered in metaphors about gluttony and kingship and mortality. But it never needed help. It stood on its own. You laughed, and the kingdom crumbled. Not in that exact moment, of course. Kingdoms never collapse all at once. But your laughter was the crack in the ice. It was the noise that said clearly and irrevocably that the body of a king was still just a body, that even power, even rule, can choke on something stupid and die smiling. The jester was exiled. They couldn't bring themselves to kill him, not for the joke, not for the timing, but he became a ghost, wandering from court to court, always welcome and never trusted. He refused to repeat the tale. He carried it like a wound, knowing that if he said it again, someone else might laugh too, hard, and they might not stop. The first time she wore it, you told her she smelled like heaven. The second time, you felt lightheaded. By the third, your vision blurred, but you blamed the wine. She applied it every evening, always behind closed doors, always in silence, letting the scent bloom in the hollow of her throat, like a secret she refused to share. You kissed her there once. You told her it reminded you of spring. She smiled and said nothing. You had married her for power, or maybe for beauty. The two were tangled, and you had long stopped pretending to know the difference. Maria de Padilla, your mistress first, your queen in all but title, wrapped in silk and silence, eyes like dusk, mouth like a vow you couldn't quite remember making. She never begged. She never plotted. She simply remained. And you, King Peter of Castile, found yourself rearranging the court to accommodate her presence, like one might shift furniture to chase a shaft of light. There were rumors, of course. There always are, when kings play favorites. They whispered about her lineage, her loyalty, her appetite. They said she was a witch, that her chambers held books bound in skin, herbs that bled when crushed, oils that hissed on the fire like serpents. You laughed at it all. You said, "Let them whisper. It only makes her more mine." But in private, you wondered. She never seemed tired. She never aged. Her skin stayed smooth, while yours weathered from war and worry. Her voice remained calm, even when yours cracked in fury behind closed doors. When she wept, she did so quietly, with tears that smelled faintly of cinnamon and something darker. You kissed them anyway. The court hated her, not because she manipulated you. They would have forgiven that, but because she didn't. She didn't need to. She sat still, and you moved. You defied your advisors, your nobles, your own mother, all without needing a single whispered order. You told yourself it was love. You told others it was strategy. You didn't know the difference anymore. Then came the headaches. You thought they were from stress. The kingdom was fracturing. Your half-brother stirred rebellion in every corner of the realm, and foreign kings circled like vultures over a battlefield, not yet bloodied. You barely slept. When you did, your dreams were strange. Smoke and roses and teeth. You woke up gasping, throat dry, skin slick, and always Maria was there watching, her perfume already applied. You tried to eat. You couldn't. Everything tasted like metal. You tried to pray. The words caught in your throat like thorns. The physicians bled you. They fed you broth and muttered Latin, and feared to meet your eyes. They didn't know, or maybe they did. Maybe they too had caught the scent on her skin and chosen silence. One night you asked her what it was. She turned to you slowly, hair unbound, lips parted as if in anticipation. "Only flowers," she said. You nodded, though you didn't believe her. You tried to recall the name of the bloom she once mentioned. Something rare, Eastern, said to open only beneath a full moon. You couldn't remember if it was real or something she had invented just to see if you would believe her. You did. The pain worsened. It crept from your stomach to your spine, from your spine to your fingertips. Your fingers trembled when you reached for her. She pressed them to her throat, let you feel the beat of her pulse beneath the scent. It was steady. Yours was not. That night, you dreamed of drowning in petals. You awoke with blood on your pillow, and still you kissed her. They found you days later, slumped in your chair, mouth ajar, tongue swollen, eyes wide with the final horror of understanding. Maria sat beside you, calm, composed, her hand folded neatly in her lap. She did not scream. She did not run. When they asked what had happened, she said, "He loved me too much," as being wind. In the Metairies foul and wise, they didn't know what to do with that. They buried you with honors, trumpets, processions, banners bearing lions and castles. No one mentioned the scent that lingered in your chambers. No one asked why the queen never wore mourning. She wore white, always white, the color of lilies, of weddings, of clean bones. The perfume disappeared. They searched her rooms and found nothing. No vials, no bottles, no labeled jars. Just a single strip of cloth, folded 4 times, kept beneath her pillow. It carried the faint trace of something floral, something sweet, something wrong. The servant who found it went blind 3 days later. He said he saw her in his dreams, pressing the cloth to her own throat, smiling. Maria outlived you by years. Some say she never smiled again. Others say she laughed once. When a courtier tried to offer her another vial of perfume, she refused. She never wore it again. She didn't need to. The memory was enough. You were enough. A king undone, not by blade or betrayal, but by a scent you begged to inhale. And somewhere, in some quiet corner of the palace, the air still held it, a trace of roses and something else. The day had started with betrayal. You woke to the sound of whispers, too soft, too purposeful, and the unmistakable shift in the weight of the room. That sensation that something was off, something just out of place, as though the very air had turned sideways. You weren't new to paranoia. You were a king. Worse, you were a contested king. Edmund Ironside, last breath of Saxon strength, temporary ruler of a fractured England, already leaning toward Danish hands. You'd survive sieges, ambushes, and a wedding held under the shadow of war. But this felt different. This felt final. It came in the form of silence. The guards outside your chamber weren't speaking. A bad sign. Soldiers talk. They gossip, cough, scuff their boots, complain about stew. But today, nothing. Just the stillness of men waiting for a signal. You didn't wait to find out who gave it. You slipped from the bed, still half-dressed, and opened the servants' passage behind the hearth. You'd memorized the exits weeks ago, in case this exact moment came. It had. You crept through the corridor like a thief, heart pounding, each footstep sounding louder in your ears than it had a right to. Behind you, boots scraped against stone. Ahead, torchlight flickered. You were surrounded by men you couldn't trust, and walls that didn't love you. The crown on your head, was temporary. So was your life. You moved faster. You reached the kitchens, abandoned for the night, reeking of fat and ash. Somewhere behind you, a door slammed. A voice shouted your name. Not the way a courtier says it, but the way a hunter calls to a stag. You ducked through the scullery and into the courtyard, slipping on the wet stones, the cold biting through your skin like a second betrayal. You thought of your father. Ethel read the unready and wondered if he'd ever run like this. Probably not. He would have ordered someone else to die in his place. You didn't have that luxury. Your path led to the stables, then the outer wall, then to the edge of the privy trench, the back road, unwatched, hidden, meant for servants, waste, and shame. But you were out of time. Somewhere behind you, steel hissed from a scabbard. You didn't hesitate. You leapt, and that was the mistake. The boards weren't meant to hold weight. Certainly not yours. Not soaked from rain and rot. The moment your feet touched the edge, they gave with a groan, less a crack than a sigh. The sigh of a kingdom watching its last native king vanish beneath filth. Your arms flailed, reaching for air, and then gravity did the rest. You plunged straight through the rotted wood and into the pit below. It wasn't just mud. It was worse than mud. Human waste. A month's worth. Maybe more. The kind of foul that sticks not just to skin, but to identity. It filled your mouth before you could scream. Your eyes burned. You kicked, thrashed, tried to find the bottom. There wasn't one. Not that you could feel. Just layers of sludge, bile, discarded refuse from men who never thought their king might die here. You gasped. The mistake. The men chasing you didn't follow. Why would they? There was no honor in dragging a king out of a latrine. No glory in a blade through a body already half drowned in excrement. They stood at the edge and waited, hands covering their noses, eyes wide, with something between awe and disgust. They didn't move. They didn't need to. You were dying on your own. Your heart pounded slower. The filth pulled at you, like it knew you didn't belong above. You tried to remember your coronation, but the image swam away, replaced by the stench and the sting and the sound of your own breath wheezing through waste. You thought about your sons. You thought about the laws you tried to pass. You thought about the Danes who would now rule without argument. You sank when they finally pulled you out hours later. It wasn't to save you, it was to verify, to witness, to confirm that King Edmund Ironside had died not on a battlefield, not by sword or decree, but in a hole dug to carry away other people's shame. You were hauled up by rope, limp, eyes wide open. No marks of blade or poison, just filth. The story spread faster than your laws ever had. The Saxons wept. The Danes laughed. The nobility tried to soften it. They claimed you'd been murdered in secret, stabbed in the gut with a Danish dagger, while squatting in privacy. It was a better story, they thought, more noble, less humiliating. But the common folk knew the truth. Servants don't lie about privies. Gossip doesn't clean itself. And the stench stayed on your name long after they burned your clothes and buried your body with proper rites. History tried to forget the specifics, but it's hard to ignore the echo of laughter in the margins of old manuscripts, a joke too perfect, a metaphor too cruel to be invented, a king undone not by politics or battle, but by gravity, rotting wood, and a poorly timed step. You were fast, the floor wasn't solid, and the crown sank with you. The fire didn't start in the throne room. It began in the kitchens, as fires often do. An ember too bold, a cloth too dry, a servant too slow. There was shouting, then running, then the heavy thud of buckets sloshing water on the wrong side of the corridor. But you, cloaked in velvet and wrapped in the weight of your lineage, did not rise from your chair, not when the smoke licked the ceiling, not when the guards ran past you, red-faced and wordless, not when the steward begged you to follow him down the servant stairs. You waved him away like a fly because you were the king, and the crown stayed on. It had taken 3 hours to dress you. The brocade alone had more silver in it than the monastery's collection plates. The sleeves brushed the ground like banners. Your collar could cut wind. You'd ordered the jewels repositioned on your circlet that morning. Too much garnet on the left, not enough topaz on the right. Your reflection had agreed. It always did. You were symmetry incarnate, wrapped in centuries of divine right and good breeding. And now you sat enthroned, smoke curling under the doors, your fingers resting lightly on the armrests, as if the whole castle wasn't breathing fire beneath. You could have escaped. The servants did, the scullery boys, the scribes, the lady who embroidered the hems of your underrobes. They fled, coughing and barefoot, clutching anything worth salvaging. You heard their footsteps echo down the stone corridors. You heard the horses scream in the stables. You even heard faintly the sound of glass bursting in the chapel as stained saints shattered into dust. Still, you stayed. To flee in disarray, unrowed and wild-eyed, would mean removing the crown, and that was unthinkable. It wasn't just ornament. It was identity. The golden band was welded at the joints, not because it needed to be, but because you had insisted it be, a permanent fit, sealed to your head like divine halo. No mere man wore the crown, only the king. And you were the king always, even now, especially now. You stood when the smoke reached your knees. It wasn't graceful. The weight of your robes made it slow, almost theatrical, as though your body protested any movement outside of ceremony. You walked to the high windows, but they were sealed with iron tracery, more decorative than useful, more simple than escape. You tried the side door, but flames bloomed in the hallway like red flowers, licking upward toward the rafters, fat with fuel. You turned back to your throne, sat down again, and waited. The fire announced itself, with sound first, groaning wood, snapping beams, the sudden wail of air being pushed out by heat. Then came the light, orange and obscene, crawling along the tapestries, like insects devouring history. Your family crest vanished in moments, devoured by flame. The ceiling cracked above you, coughing out sparks like a dying dragon. You adjusted the drape of your robe, and then the crown began to heat. You didn't feel it at first. The sweat came early, pooling under your collar, soaking the lining of your sleeves. You could feel the velvet sticking to your skin, clinging like regret. But the crown, your crown, was metal, and metal remembers fire. It grew warm, then hot, then unbearable. The gold pressed against your temples like an iron brand. But you didn't move. To touch it would be to admit discomfort. To remove it would be to abandon kingship. So you let it burn. By the time the first flames reached your robes, your face was already blistering. The skin behind your ears bubbled where the crown's edges curled inward. Your hair sparked like dry grass. And still you sat. When the smoke blackened the room, you closed your eyes, but not from fear. Never fear, just preservation. If you were going to die, you would die without flinching. The guards found you later, or what was left. The fire had eaten most of the tower, but your throne remained intact, blackened, and surrounded by ash. And in it, bones, legs crossed, spine rigid, and atop the scorched skull, fused into the bone itself, a crown melted into permanence. They had to chisel it free. It took 3 men and several prayers. They said you looked peaceful. They lied. No one dies peacefully in fire. They tried to rewrite the story. The monks said you were taken too soon, a victim of fate, of accident, of cruel providence. But the servants whispered the truth, that you could have fled, that the doors were open, that someone had begged you to run, and you had refused because you didn't want to be seen without your symbol. The court poets tried to romanticize it, that you burned with your kingdom, that you were regal until the end. But the people remembered the smell, the sizzle of silk, the pitiful silhouette of a crown glowing red as it cooked your skull. Vanity is rarely silent. Yours screamed. The tide was cruel that day, though it disguised itself in calm. The gray sea rolled gently beneath a sky heavy with secrets, its surface too smooth to trust. You stood on the deck in robes too fine for salt air, hands behind your back in the posture of command, trying not to betray the shiver crawling up your spine. The salt clung to your skin like a second layer of shame, and you hated it. You hated the ship, the ocean, the wet wind whispering like old curses through the rigging. But most of all, you hated that you had to run. Kings weren't supposed to flee. Kings were supposed to rally, to fight, to fall in battle or die with poison in a jeweled cup. But the baronses had turned. The French were closing in, and your advisors, those vultures disguised in silk, had whispered the word retreat, as if it were strategy and not surrender. So you boarded the ship under cover of dusk, dragging what was left of your dignity behind you in a chest full of royal seals, half-melted coin and unread treaties. You didn't know how to swim. You didn't admit that, of course. You'd mocked your brother once for flailing like a fish in a palace fountain, and pride has a long memory. It wasn't expected anyway. Kings didn't swim. Kings were carried across water in gilded barges, fanned by boys too young to mutiny. Kings didn't splash. They glided. But now the gliding had ended, and you stood there, very much alone, on a ship packed with men who would have sold you to the enemy for a single night of safety. The storm came with no warning, just one moment of eerie quiet, then a sound like the world exhaling through a broken flute. The sails snapped like whips. The sea erupted in fury. You clutched the rail with hands not made for work and felt it lurch beneath you like a drunken beast. The captain barked orders that dissolved into the roar of wind. Rain came in sideways sheets, cold and blinding, and then the wave. It didn't crash so much as engulf. A wall of water, tall as a castle, dark as night, tipped itself gently into the boat, as if to say, "I've been waiting for this." The deck vanished. You tumbled. No one caught you. You hit the sea with the weight of every lie you'd ever told. Your robes, sodden with velvet and regret, clung to your limbs like anchors. Your crown, yes, you'd worn it, even here, even now, slid forward over your brow, pressing down until your eyes burned. Your boots filled with sea otter, your lungs filled with panic, and then silence. You sank faster than you thought possible, not like a man, like a statue, like some monument dragged from its pedestal by unseen hands. The water was thick and endless, and in it you felt the weight of everything you had tried to hold. The documents, the kingdom, the divine right you never fully believed in, all of it dragged you down. The crown shifted again, digging into your scalp as if to remind you who you were. You thrashed, but it wasn't thrashing. Not really, just jerking. A futile attempt to turn panic into motion. You opened your mouth to scream and swallowed the sea instead. There was no resistance, no dramatic fight, just cold and the fading shape of the world above you narrowing like the end of a tunnel you would never reach. You remembered dimly the stories told of drowning, that it was peaceful after a while, that the lungs stopped screaming and everything went soft. But they were wrong. It wasn't peaceful. It was humiliating. You weren't defeated by sword or sabotage. You were undone by water and wool. When they found your body, it was half a mile from where the ship had broken apart. The fish had been gentle. Only the face was bloated, eyes open, mouth agape in an unfinished sentence no one would ever hear. The crown was still on your head, bent, salt-rusted, slightly askew. They buried you in haste. A quiet grave in a wet field. No ceremony, no procession. Just a few wet monks chanting badly remembered verses as the rain returned to cover the sound of dirt falling on flesh. The chroniclers struggled. They couldn't write that you drowned like a peasant, like some tavern drunk who slipped on a pier. They tried to paint it as noble, a voyage cut short, a sudden storm, God's mysterious will. But everyone knew. The barons whispered it in their halls. The French laughed it through their noses. The peasants told their children, even kings can sink. You, who once ruled half of England, were swallowed by the one thing you never learned to navigate. And the sea didn't even notice. The curtain wasn't supposed to fall then. It had been measured, weighed, tested for its dramatic timing and fabric flow weeks before the performance. You had paced beneath it yourself, arm outstretched in the dusty torchlight, declaring this was to be your masterpiece, not just the play, but the event, the whole of it, a spectacle of pageantry and poetry, all arranged to unveil your brilliance and elevate the court's dull evenings to something more celestial. The nobles would marvel. The scribes would take notes, and posterity would finally give you the kind of paragraph in the chronicle reserved for those who made art out of politics or politics out of art. You were ready to be remembered. What you were not ready for was the mechanism giving out. 30 seconds early, you wore tights. Of course you did. Royal purple ones with a doublet, so gold-threaded it sparkled like something divinely cursed. Your wig was powdered into submission, your cheeks just a touch rouged for the lights. You had refused to let the understudy take the lead role. Not tonight, not when the whole play was a thinly veiled metaphor for your own life, for your genius misunderstood, for the burdens of leadership born in verse. No one else could carry the rhythm. No one else could wear the crown you wrote for yourself. You had rewritten the ending 3 times. The final monologue was a lament by your favorite tone, where the noble character, also named very nearly after yourself, addressed the fickle court and begged the gods for a shred of honest legacy. Then came the flourish. A candle would dim, a trumpet would blare, the curtain would fall, the house would rise to its feet, and history would be made. But the candle didn't dim yet, the trumpet hadn't blared, and the curtain, that heavy tapestry of embroidered velvet and bad luck, dropped early, without rhythm, without warning, without grace. It struck you full in the neck. The sound was a cross between a sack of grain hitting a marble step and the pop of a wine cork under pressure. You stumbled, knocked forward by an object meant only for dramatic punctuation, and tried to turn it into part of the performance. You even raised your hand, a fluttering gesture to signal. Maybe it was intentional. Maybe this was avant-garde, but your legs didn't follow. Your knees buckled. You made a wheezing noise that wasn't in the script, and then you collapsed. For a moment, the audience applauded. A noblewoman in the second row leaned in and whispered something about your commitment to realism. A young page clapped hard, believing this was a trick ending. A scribe dipped his quill with renewed vigor. It was bold, they thought, daring death as art. You lay there, your mouth ajar, eyes glassy, foot twitching as the curtain pulled around your body like a final insult. Someone laughed. Then someone screamed. The curtain rod had snapped under its own weight. Too much gold braid. Too little engineering. The pulley jammed. A spike meant to secure the left flank had torn through your collarbone. Blood, thin and too red for theater paint, was soaking into the hem of your own costume design. When the stagehands rushed in, it took 3 of them to lift the velvet off you. Your crown rolled across the floor like a forgotten prop. A dog from her backstage wandered in and sniffed your shoe. There was no final line, no applause worth remembering. You were pronounced dead before the first intermission. The nobles didn't know what to do. Some stayed in their seats out of politeness or shock, unsure whether this too was part of your vision. A servant whispered that it might be a test, that perhaps if they clapped hard enough, you'd rise again in some dramatic resurrection twist. They clapped. Nothing happened. The dog barked. The clapping stopped. The queen asked if the wine would still be served. Eventually, they dragged your body backstage and covered it with the same prop tapestry that once hung over your bed in the summer palace. No one wanted to move you too much, not out of respect, but out of confusion. There were no instructions for this in the royal playbook, no clause about what to do if the dramatist king dies by his own stage directions. Rumors ignited like wildfire through the corridors before your corpse had cooled. Some said the curtain was cursed, a gift from a jealous playwright you once exiled. Others said it was divine judgment, punishment for hubris, wrapped in amic pentameter. A few whispered you faked it, and that you would return next week under a mask, ready to unveil your next act. But you didn't. The funeral was rushed, held between rehearsals of a farce someone found in your archives. A troupe of lesser actors recited lines from your earlier works, skipping most of the monologues. The bishop refused to call it martyrdom. The undertaker refused to remove the costume. They buried you in your own wig. The theater closed for 1 week. Then it reopened under new management. They left the curtain as it was, mended, rehung, slightly off-kilter, and called it tradition. Every opening night, someone touches it for luck. No one speaks your name. The scribe who attended your final performance eventually wrote the line they thought you wanted. He died doing what he loved, then scratched it out and replaced it with, he died because the curtain was too heavy, which, if nothing else, was the truth. The goose had always been there. You just hadn't noticed it until the day it lunged for your face. At first, it was simply one of many animals cluttering the courtyard, wandering between barrels and boots, honking with the brainless authority of all domestic fowl. Your men laughed when it hissed at them, slapped its waddling behind, threw crumbs like blessings. It was a joke, a running gag, a creature you might half-jokingly refer to in court as the White Sentinel. Some even claimed it bowed when you passed. You found this amusing. You thought it was a sign. But the goose remembered things. You were a prince after all, barely noble, ambiguously revered. Your lineage traced more through rumor than parchment. The eastern steppe was a hard place for myths to thrive, so you did your best to wear yours like a cloak. You trained with the saber. You rode with elegance. You could recite parts of the Psalter in a voice that sounded like prophecy if heard in the right candlelight. You were building something, a legacy perhaps, or a tale, and you had kicked the goose. It was months ago, maybe a year, during a festival, when too much honeymead made everything blur. The bird was underfoot, and you were dancing with a girl whose name you never learned, and the goose hissed just once, a tiny defiance, and you lashed out without thinking. A boot to the breast, not enough to kill, just enough to send it skidding across the cobbles like a stone on ice. The courtyard laughed. The goose did not. From then on, it watched you. It didn't avoid you, didn't flee like the other livestock when your retinue thundered through. It lingered. It stood in doorways and waited. It perched on fence posts with eerie stillness. You would think it had gone, then find it again, always at a distance that felt slightly too deliberate. The guards joked that it followed you on hunts, that it waddled behind your horse with unshakable loyalty. Then the servants began to complain. Bruised shins, pecked fingers, a stable boy missing, a patch of hair from his head. When you summoned them to complain about the smell of the laundry or the thickness of the soup, they whispered about the goose in the shadows, and their eyes darted behind you. You should have had it killed, but you didn't. Perhaps because it seemed too petty, too undignified. What kind of prince issues a writ of execution for a goose? You had crushed rebels, taxed widows, turned brothers into spies. But somehow this felt beneath you, so you let it live, and it waited. The day of your death was unremarkable, at least until it wasn't. A fog lay low over the village, like breath held too long. You woke late, your head thick from the wine you claimed to drink only ceremonially. You dressed in blue and silver, the colors of winter, though no one remembered why. You waved lazily to peasants and barked at your guards for their muddy boots. Your cloak snagged on a nail, your crown itched, and the goose was in the courtyard. Again, it stood alone, wings low, eyes fixed. You paused, uneasy. It didn't honk, it didn't move, just waited, neck slightly tilted like it was listening to something you couldn't hear. A strange tightness settled in your chest. You walked faster. You told yourself it was nothing. You laughed too loudly. You turned your back. That was your mistake. It struck like lightning. There was no sound before it, no warning flap, no prelude honk, only the sudden awful weight of wings and beak and fury against the back of your head. You staggered, tripped on the hem of your robe, slammed into a barrel of pickled fish that exploded like sour confetti. The bird was on your chest, flapping, striking, talons digging into your face. You screamed. It didn't stop. Your guards froze. One dropped a spear. Another shouted, "Is it enchanted?" before turning and running. No one helped. No one wanted to be the one who killed the prince's favorite animal, if it was your favorite. Was it? Hadn't you once toasted to its health? Hadn't you joked about naming it air? The goose's beak pierced your eye. Blood sprayed in an arc across the cobblestones. You tried to crawl, hand outstretched toward the chapel, or the well, or anywhere that might feel holy enough to offer last rites. But the bird followed, relentless. Feathers smeared crimson, eyes burning, with something too focused to be instinct. You made it 5 paces before it tore your throat. You died on your back, staring at the sky through one good eye and a fog of feathers. By the time the guards returned with courage and clubs, the bird had vanished. Some say it flew. Others swore it simply walked away, unconcerned, stepping delicately over your outstretched hand like a courtier late to supper. They buried you quickly. There was little ceremony. No bard wanted to immortalize the tale. No tapestry could quite thread it without tipping into farce. The priests muttered something about divine punishment for pride. A peasant girl whispered that the goose was a spirit sent by old gods to remind rulers that animals, too, could have vengeance. You were replaced within the week. The new prince banned all birds from the courtyard. No feathers, no fowl, no mention of geese. But some nights when the wind is low and the guards drink too deeply, they say they hear it, a lone honk echoing through the mist, waiting, watching, plotting again. The coins were warm when they went into your mouth. That was the first sign something was wrong. Gold shouldn't have body heat, but these had been clutched too long, handled too greedily, passed from trembling servant to sweating treasurer, to your own shaking hands, like relics of salvation. You had called for them at dawn, raving already, barefoot in your nightshirt, demanding that the vaults be opened and the money brought to you as flesh. Those were your words, as flesh. It was the famine officially. Crops failed, rivers dried, and the peasants stopped praying. In truth, the rot started long before that, when the granaries were sold to fund peacock hunts and fortresses built only for shadow wars, when taxes became performance art, when you began to believe your own weight in gold was a reasonable metaphor for the health of the kingdom. You'd once said, smiling to a court that dared not blink, As long as I sit on treasure, no man can say, we are poor. But the throne began to list under you. You refused to sell the crown jewels, not because of tradition or pride or even vanity, but because you had grown used to seeing yourself reflected in them. You liked the shape of your own wealth, the curve of it, the way light bent around your presence. The vaults beneath the castle were full of silver and copper and gold, all catalogued, all untouched. Your people starved. You threw feasts for mirrors. No one sang at court anymore, but the coins still clinked. You began to speak to them. At first, it was harmless. A joke at supper, a whispered apology as you dropped one down the spiral staircase for luck. Then came the long night spent alone in the treasury, sitting cross-legged like a monk in a shrine of currency. You talked to the coins, but more disturbingly, you began to believe they talked back. They told you things, soothing things, flattering things, dangerous things. They told you they loved you, that they would never betray you, that only they understood what it was to be king. Your ministers tried. One brought charts. Another offered her resignation, wrapped in a plea. One wept. You laughed at them all. You told them they didn't understand the future, the radiant economy you were becoming. I am the mint, you told them. I am the treasury, and the banker, and the banked. When the bishop attempted to intervene, you replaced him with a statue made entirely of melted chalices. Now, he listens, you said. By the time the capital rioted, you no longer recognized the smell of bread. It was on the day the gates fell that you made your decision. You ordered your most loyal guard to fetch the chest, the heavy one. The coins were cleaned in rose water, dried with silk, and placed into a golden bowl you once used for doves. You sat cross-legged on the floor, spine rigid, eyes wide. You dipped your hand in. At first, it was just the act, the gesture. You had convinced yourself it was symbolic, a royal ritual, a final unification of body and currency. One coin placed gently on the tongue, cold now, heavy, sharp-edged. You swallowed it. It hurt, but you smiled. You looked around the empty room, daring the walls to flinch. Then another, then another. Somewhere in the distance, metal rang against stone. You took that as a pause. You were halfway through the bowl when something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, just a tightening, a pause between swallows that didn't quite relax. You coughed once, politely, as if excusing yourself from your own execution. Then again, harder. Your eyes began to water. The bowl tipped slightly in your lap as your arms went slack. The coin you had just placed on your tongue slipped back against your throat and did not move. You tried to breathe. The coin refused. You clawed at your neck. The gold remained still, lodged like irony incarnate. Your lips turned blue, while your fingers still gripped more treasure. One final act of possession, one last refusal to let go. They found you slumped forward, face buried in a bowl of coins, body curled like a miser's apostle. For a full hour, no one touched you. The servants whispered that perhaps it was a trick or a test or even a transmutation in progress. It wasn't until your hand finally released and the coins spilled like vomit onto the floor that they understood. The court physicians could not agree on the number of coins inside you. Some said 12, Others swore it was 40, like the days of flood. The most dramatic account claimed you had consumed enough to pay a year's wages for 1,000 men. None of it mattered. They melted the bowl. They scattered your ashes over the mint you had built and named after yourself. The rebellion took the treasury, then left it untouched. No one wanted cursed coin. The new king refused to be crowned in your hall. He built a wooden dais in the village square and gave his speech barefoot, holding no scepter. When asked why, he said only, "I have no appetite. Is it my many brings of the econ? Some say your ghost still haunts the vault, not walking, not wailing, just crouched in the corner, trying to eat gold in silence, but it always falls through every time. The robe was polyester, but it felt royal. You slipped it over your t-shirt with the reverence of a monk, donning sacred vestments, tugging the itchy hem straight as the staff member with the clipboard gave you the nod. You were King Alaric the Wise today, or maybe Edmund the Resolute. It didn't really matter. The fair changed the signage hourly, depending on who was sober enough to wear the beard. What mattered was that you were king, and the children believed you. Their wide eyes, their sticky fingers, clutching wooden swords, their gasps when you raised the foam scepter like thunder itself. It was all worth it. They gave you a scroll with fake Latin and some ye old phrases you were meant to pronounce solemnly. You overdid it. You always overdid it. That's why they kept asking you back. You told your friends it was just for fun. A laugh, a harmless side gig with turkey legs and chainmail, and the occasional huzzah. You didn't mention the thrill you felt when the gates opened and peasants bowed to you in jest. You didn't tell them you practiced your declarations in the bathroom mirror. You didn't tell them you were starting to dream in Middle English. The fairgrounds sprawled with the chaos of make-believe. A-barrels beside porta-otties. Wench costumes bought online already unraveling. Teenagers chain smoking behind the trebuchet. You strutted past it all, your paper crown slightly tilted, your thrift store boots squeaking. You had a throne. Well, a lawn chair draped in velvet, and you held court like it mattered. People asked for selfies. A toddler curtsied. You declared 3 chickens, property of the realm. You were adored. Then came the duel. It wasn't on the schedule. A spontaneous reenactment, someone said. A surprise event to delight the commoners. You were told to stand on the platform and look regal, while 2 armored volunteers staged a clunky sword fight in the dirt. You did as you were told. You straightened your crown. You raised your scepter. You whispered a blessing in faux Latin. The sword glanced off a shin. Someone tripped. Someone bled, just a little, and the crowd gasped like it was real. And that's when the voice rang out. Treason. You laughed. Good improv. You raised your hand to pardon the accused. The stocks came out anyway. You thought it was part of the scene. You thought, of course, they'd make a game of it. Dunk the king, pelt the ruler with foam apples, throw sponges. You even played along, raising your hands, in mock surrender, joking in your best theatrical baritone. I am undone. The crown is heavy, but your arms are stronger. The crowd loved it. Someone yelled, "Down with the monarchy," and you bowed as they roared. Then they locked the stocks. Proper wood, splinters against your wrists. Your neck cramped. Instantly, you tried to shift, couldn't. You looked up, smiling, still playing. But no one was laughing anymore. They started throwing things. Not foam, not sponges. Real food, half-eaten pretzels, bruised apples, something that might have once been a cinnamon bun. A child screamed in joy. You tried to yell, "Okay, okay, jokes is over." But your voice cracked and your mouth filled with crusted sugar. Someone wiped your crown off and stomped on it. You told yourself it was still part of the show, that any minute now the director would shout, "Cut!" Or your friend from the falconry tent would come running breathless, apologizing for the mix-up. But no one came. The crowd swelled, cheering your disgrace with the glee of a village finally free of taxes. A boy kicked your shin. An old man spat at your feet. You had never felt so seen. Hours passed. You weren't sure how long. The sun moved. Your shoulders ached. You could feel the sweat drying inside your robe. The fair moved on without you. Somewhere nearby, someone was roasting corn. Someone else played a lute badly. The scent of funnel, cake wafted past, cruel and indifferent. You closed your eyes. You opened them again, and it was night. The crowd had thinned. The lights glared. A moth bumped against your nose. A man dressed as a plague doctor stood 10 F-tut away, completely still. You tried to ask for help. He just tilted his head. You remembered volunteering. You remembered the form you signed, the one with the waiver and the line about immersion experiences. You remembered laughing. What's the worst that could happen? You said, "Put me in the dungeon." You didn't think they meant it. The next morning, the fair resumed. No one unlocked the stocks. They added a new sign in front of you. Tyrant King, traitor to the realm. Children posed beside it, making silly faces. A vendor sold prints of you weeping. You thought you saw your cousin walk past. He didn't stop. You began to wonder if there had ever been a time before the stocks. If your name had always been all Alaric, the Forsaken. If you had ever worked in it. If you had a cat. If you had dreams. You tried to ask a passing knight how long this reenactment lasted. He said, "Until the kingdom forgets." Then he offered you a turkey leg. You couldn't hold it. The paper crown was gone, but you still felt its weight. You imagined the glue lines etched into your forehead, the lingering scent of gold, spray paint. You tried to laugh, thinking maybe that would wake you up. Maybe this was part of it. A very elaborate prank, a surprise promotion, a deep game of lar chicken. But no one laughed with you. The world had moved on. And the worst part wasn't the pain. It wasn't the splinters, or the humiliation, or the slow realization that no one remembered your real name. It was that in some dark, treacherous corner of your heart, you liked the attention. You were king once for an hour, and now you belong to the fair.